Welcome to my crib.
Are you ready for it?
This person can't even spell banker.
It's not banker.
Hey, got my vibe and I'm feeling alright, love energy for life. Got my cool, got my feeling, we're keeping it real. We were meant to play tonight.
What you got there?
£4 lunch from Domino's.
£4?
Have £4.
You ready for it now?
We just eat. Five Guys.
It's me, Jonathan Warburton.
Ready for it now?
It's over there, mate.
Make it loud. Yeah, that's us walking in.
You eat food?
Yeah, I eat food. You eat food?
I had food for breakfast.
We're back.
Vintage.
Brittany's counting on us.
Just sold my car to rebuy any car.
And we're having a pint at the Dog and Trumpet after work.
Not bad.
We're back again.
Love you, Dad.
Back again.
Something like that, J-Dubs?
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Hello, welcome everyone for this afternoon. Unfortunately, you've got me for this hour and a half session, and I wanted to showcase that because we're doing a session on the business of television. And isn't that the business that we all got into? Isn't that really, really cool? Big shout out to Thinkbox, by the way, who put that together for us. I thought a really amazing sort of mosaic of the ads that occur in the UK, quality advertising, as you can see. And, you know, what we're here to do is provide audiences and consumers so we can provide a platform for advertisers to view that sort of stuff. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. So, like I said, we're going to do a session here that's looking at the core fundamentals of the business of telly. Is it a good business? Is it a strong business? Why do analysts view it so negatively? And what can we do about it? And I think you'll agree with me, there's no better person to kick this off to illustrate the challenges in the financial world that this industry faces than a fellow who writes about it all the time, looks at the differences between North America and Europe. So with that in mind, I want to do two things. Obviously, give him a big round of applause, but also slightly make fun of him for the ridiculous shoes that he's wearing. Have a look. They are worse than you could possibly imagine. So with that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, Ian Whittaker. Yes, they're green.
They are. So I like to be anti-consensus. If I want to be consensus, I'd wear a pair of Adidas Gazelles. Anyway. Just a little bit about my background. For those who don't know me, I was an equities analyst for 20 years in the city. I covered media and tech. I was twice analyst of the year during that time. I set up my own company. I'll make and I still cover the sectors. I'll make a couple of references in here, and just to give sort of background, some other background, because it'll reference some of the slides. By training, I'm a historian, more recently a war historian. Also as well, how would I describe it? A semi-professional political gambler. And you'll see sort of why I reference that on these slides, because I think there's quite a few things that TV can actually learn across a range of the spectrum. Now, what I'm going to start off with is I'm going to split this up into what TV does right, what it does wrong, and then make some suggestions essentially as to what TV should do, with some conclusions at the end. So what does TV actually do right? The key thing is actually delivers for advertisers. This is Unilever going back at the height of inflation for what happened in terms of their pricing growth. And what happened with many of these firms, first half of 2022, facing an inflationary crisis, they thought we're never going to get these price increases through to consumers. What happened? They did, and more so. You listen to what company CEOs and CFOs talk about when they say why that happened. Almost unanimously, they talk about the strength of the brand. And in terms of that, TV has been absolutely fundamental in terms of delivering that. So for many advertisers, when it comes down in terms of the financials and delivering against their strategic priorities, TV has actually delivered. But also as well, it works on audiences. This is from the CNN exit poll, looking at Kamala Harris, or Trump versus Harris, in terms of the performance. You can see there on the left-hand side that Trump sort of did much better in 2020, apart from one category, 65 plus, say, older. Harris massively outspent Trump on TV. hugely, probably by a factor more than 2 to 1. Now, of course, you can say that actually there may be other factors that are involved in this, but there's no doubt about it when you look that TV audiences tend to skew older, and indeed that she massively outspent in that category, that it looks at least it had some sort of an influence on the outcome of the election. But also as well, TV sets the agenda. If you think back in terms of the post office scandal for those who are from the UK, sort of Mr. Bates and so forth, or indeed delivering live events that deliver mass market audiences, there is still really only one medium that gets a very large mass market audience at one particular point in time that is absolutely crucial for advertisers. And if you look at sort of the concerns about, well, is TV actually losing ground from the linear side because it's losing advertising revenues? Certainly in the case of Europe, there's a question mark over the US. What you're finding is that AVOD, BVOD, whatever you want to call it, is compensating for the loss of linear TV revenues. But the final point is probably the most important one. So that it produces content that people want to watch. And it goes back to this point before, sort of at the end of the day, this is all about actually attracting audiences. If that's the case, then what does TV do wrong? Well, the first thing I'd argue is that essentially it's very much lost the narrative in terms of things. These are stills from the Russian Revolution. You recognize the figure on the left. The figure on the right is Tsar Nicholas II, last Tsar of Russia. The middle is a picture of the Russian Revolution itself. They say for revolution to succeed, what it needs is it needs a fanatical minority, an apathetic majority, and a weak authority. TV, at the moment, is the weak authority. It has allowed others to set the agenda in terms of where it stands. And so what happens is it's very much on the defensive when it comes to arguing its strengths. And one of the factors behind that is that, quite frankly, when you look at the media industry and you look at sort of TV as well, these are not sort of typical normal people. There is a large difference in the media habits of TV people, and indeed media people, from the rest of the population. This is ThinkSpot data. And what all of that has actually sort of allowed is it's allowed a sort of view set of managed decline to set in. For those who are British and of a certain age, this is from the 1970s, Winter of Discontent, figure on the right is the Prime Minister at the time. This is very much the sort of tone that comes across from TV at the moment. That very much what they're doing is they're on the back foot. That some of these initiatives are not really about driving growth. What they're really doing is replacing losses. And when you lose confidence in your product, then don't be surprised if other people lose confidence in it as well. And that includes advertisers. What it also means as well is that essentially sort of the broadcasters have gone into strategic moves that, quite frankly, are not the right ones. And I think a lot of this is down to panic. Now, sort of figure here is Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel made a point that essentially there is a difference here between boldness in military actions and a gamble. Boldness is sort of a move that can have great success, but crucially, you leave yourself room, if there's a failure, to survive. Sort of a gamble is essentially where you bet everything on the bank. My concern is a lot of broadcasters are going for the latter and betting everything on the bank. And what do I mean by that? Well, a strategy, for example, where certain broadcasters have talked about that linear TV is dead and they must all go in on digital. That's only going to give off a signal to the market. It's wrong, because at the end of the day, if that strategy does not work out, and indeed some of these broadcasters are finding that now, it's very hard to retreat from that, because you've essentially given the message that your core product, linear TV, isn't worth that much anymore. And again, people breathe that in, advertisers breathe that in. But fundamentally, and this would be the biggest concern it would have, TV is falling into the newspaper trap. Now, if you look at what happened with the newspapers 15 years ago, what they did was they believed fundamentally that essentially they have to give in to the demands of the tech players, that essentially in terms of their own agency, they didn't have that much, and that again, fundamentally, they were in a weak position. And if you look at what the newspapers did then, they turned around and said, okay, our content, we have to give away for free. We need to actually move away from our core product. What happened to the newspapers? From an advertising perspective, they declined into irrelevance. This is from Paramount, when Paramount allowed TikTok to actually take Mean Girls and slice the content into music videos. TikTok was making money, great for TikTok in terms of that, and TikTok could go to advertisers and say, you know what, with content like this, we're getting more audience time, and therefore you should put more advertising money on us. What did Paramount get out of it? Sure, they got a bit of a revenue stream, but actually in terms of what they did structurally for their business, sort of fundamentally these sorts of deals are catastrophically bad. Kelly from ITV will be on in a few minutes to tell you why I'm fundamentally wrong on that. But so what can TV do? So last year I ended my presentation with this, but I'll start it off in terms of at the beginning of this section. Last thing is, the first thing rather, get out of a mindset where essentially you think you're on the back foot. This is a quote from Winston Churchill, actually where it's got newspapers. He talked about France. But apologies to all those in the room, but the point is absolutely key, that where TV at the moment has allowed itself to get into a frame of mind where essentially it thinks it is looking at defeat, and the only thing it can do is essentially stave off the inevitable. But actually, when you go back and look at some of those dire predictions that were going around 5-6 years ago, what you see is fundamentally they were wrong. So, this is SVOD. You go back around 5 years ago, people would have been telling you that SVOD penetration would be getting up to around 90%. In the UK market, everyone would be watching SVOD content. It'd be taking over in terms of the audiences. What's happened? It's flatlined at around just under 70%, and has been the case for a number of quarters. If you look in terms of the Barb schedules, sure, you'll get a couple of Netflix programs that are on there, but fundamentally, the programming is still dominated by linear TV. Those worst case scenarios haven't happened. And one thing I would argue is it's be a very interesting exercise to go back and look at what people were suggesting 4 to 5 years ago in terms of their forecasts and see whether they've actually turned down. Now, that is not to say that linear TV doesn't have its problems. Indeed, it does. It is a declining product. Let's not get away from that simple fact. But like an army in retreat, you can have two types of retreat. You can have the one on the left, which is Dunkirk, which essentially it's done in order. You keep the bulk of your forces, you survive to another day, and in fact, it actually gives you a successful ground for a counterattack. Or what you can do is that you can actually retreat in chaos. And that's the point at which generally people tend to lose most of their forces. And this is from the First World War, the Third Battle of Amiens in 1918. They call it the Black Day of the German Army. Point being here is that what I'm concerned about is that TV is falling into a trap on the right-hand side. What it's doing in terms of some of the measures is becoming potentially more of a rout than necessarily organised retreat. So with linear TV, bear in mind, it is still an incredibly valuable product, even though it is in decline. Now, you'll recognise some of these figures. On the left-hand side is Lindsay Clay of ThinkBox, and then we have Evan Shapiro on the right-hand side. They had a debate about the whole whether you go you should put your content on YouTube or not. I'm with Lindsay on this one. I think the analysis that was done in terms of saying why more advertising money should go to YouTube fundamentally was flawed. In terms of that, and for a variety of reasons. But you know what? That doesn't count. The rationality of it doesn't count, because what most advertisers are really looking for is a narrative. And the narrative actually works out well that YouTube has actually got X amount of viewership, and therefore it should get X amount of advertising money on here. The problem when TV broadcasters are putting their content onto YouTube is what they're thinking is, well, it's a good way to distribute their content. The problem is two things. One, you're never getting the full amount of money yourself as a broadcaster. But the second thing is you're actually giving those platforms the content to go back to advertisers and saying, you know what? We're actually taking more audience share. Therefore, you should actually give us more advertising money. You're providing the bullets for the gun for those platforms to actually shoot you. Now, that's an uncomfortable message because it's been the strategy for many companies. But it's one that's true because at the end of the day, advertising, when it boils down to it, is a share game. One of the fundamental mistakes that I always hear when people talk about advertising is they talk about, if you get, this amount of CPMs and the CPM rate is this, therefore it delivers this advertising revenues. That's not how advertising revenues work. Companies only have a limited amount of advertising money. You are fighting in a share game. And if you do anything that allows your competitor to actually take share from you, or actually make the argument that you should be losing share to them, then essentially sort of you're not putting yourself in a good position. But also as well, bear in mind this fundamental point, what I said at the start. Yeah, the broadcasters have a lot of great content. We tend to like to think that everyone's going to be watching dancing cats and that's all they want to do. They actually don't. People like long-form content. They like premium long-form content. You can see that in terms of the audience numbers. That is TV's strength. It is what it has been producing for 70, 80, 90 years, in terms of that it has a hell of a lot more experience of it than the platforms do. But if you do want to go short form, yeah, TV's actually got an advantage here. If you look at the top 2 categories, in terms of what's the most watched short form content in the UK, DIY, how-to, and news. Those should be ideal for a broadcaster if they wanted to exploit short form video. Point being is so far they haven't. They've actually effectively allowed this market to be captured by somebody else instead of thinking about the ways they could do it themselves. The other thing I'd say for broadcasters, they should show essentially how they matter to advertisers. This is a survey that I sort of co-wrote with the IPA. It looks at how financial analysts sort of viewed the most important attributes of a company. Strength of brand and marketing is the top one, sort of on there. Yeah. The brand is extremely important to the financial community that drives many of the decisions that CEOs and CFOs make. And if you take the strength of the brand, TV is in an ideal position to actually link itself to that. So what would be the 3 points that I would end on? Slightly controversial, although it's got a nice picture of a dog, as well as 5 kilos of amphetamines. The point being here is that when we talk about what particularly the social media sort of companies have done, but tech in general, there's an argument of saying, well, they've made sort of their users addicted to the product. That's what you often hear, sort of in terms of that. Actually, their greatest success when it comes to if it were making sort of addicts of people, the actual advertisers, and actually sort of people in the agencies, because there is this sort of natural tendency for people there to think, you know what, we need to go with tech. We need to go with online products. Not necessarily because they're better, but because the way the system has been set up is essentially sort of to promote that. So the first thing I'd say is that TV needs to recognize what it's actually fighting against when it comes to, they're very powerful when it comes to the agency and the advertising level. There's a very strong natural bias towards using online. But also as well, sort of what it can do is again, capture the narrative. You go back to Barack Obama in 2008, if you looked at it rationally, he shouldn't have won. He was a junior senator from Illinois. He was in the midst of the global financial crisis. He was up against a much more senior opponent in terms of John McCain. And yet, it was his message, essentially, of talking about hope during that time that won him a landslide victory. And that's what I'd argue that TV needs. It needs to go back to the points and say, look, we very much deliver for advertisers. You can see that in terms of the financial numbers. Yeah, this is what we can deliver, and this is therefore why we still have relevance. And I know it's not going to be the most popular figure to bring up at the end, but actually it's got sort of a, it does have a lot of relevance. So there was a book in 2002 that was called The Emerging Democratic Majority. What it talked about at the time was saying that the future politics in the US was inevitably democratic. Why? Because essentially you would have more Hispanic voters, you would have more black voters, women were turning more towards the Democratic Party, and therefore the Republicans were at a structural disadvantage. And very much that was the message that the Republican Party took very much to heart, led it to a big disadvantage in the elections, until this man came along and actually blew up that narrative in terms of that. And said, you know what, we can appeal to these voters, we can actually get their audiences, the accepted narrative is wrong, and this is how we do it. And he did it very successfully on here. And the point I would argue, sort of, and this is probably the most fundamental point, is that for TV, what it needs to do is essentially believe in itself that it actually can turn things around. Because it does have the products there, it does have the capabilities, it has the experience. What I'd argue it actually needs at the moment is the belief. Thank you very much.
Right. Right, just a couple of things there is next time you do a presentation for us, the marketing team are going to definitely support you with some high-res JPEGs.
Yeah. Thank you.
Lindsay Clay is not going to be happy with that image that she just seen up there. And I'm sorry to the ThinkBox team who's sitting there. I don't know what the hell you got that from, but let's see your slides prior. Very, very quick answer. Why do analysts tend to undervalue broadcasters as they are at the moment? And I mean the financial analysts, because that's the community that you tend to engage with the most.
Well, actually, I'd say it's the same reason that advertisers do. You know, what tends to happen is people extrapolate from their own experiences, and they go across it and they sort of say this is the common experience for the population. So I had that slide showing the difference between media audiences and general population in terms of the media habits. People who are financial analysts don't watch Coronation Street or EastEnders. Yet they don't watch linear TV. They watch streaming, they watch other things. And therefore, what they think is, quite frankly, it's a dying product. Yeah. They accept the sort of view. And that's, I would say, singly, that's the single biggest factor. And it's the single biggest problem that the broadcasters face.
Yes, no, have you bought some shares in broadcasters then recently to demonstrate that value, that optimism you have?
I haven't got, you know what, I haven't got any spare money. I spent it all on my shoes.
Yeah. It doesn't look like it from here, but I'll take your word for it.
Yeah. Take my word for it.
Yeah, I'll take your word for it. Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Whittaker.
Thank you very much.